Time stood still as the metallic click echoed in the night. A gun drawn, aimed directly at my wife. In that heart-stopping moment, my mind spun. Do I throw myself in front of her? Do I try to talk him down? Or do I make some desperate move to distract him? But what happened next, no one in that neighborhood would ever forget. So I recently went through something I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't lived it myself. It started like all stories do, so quietly, with a moving truck rumbling to a stop in front of our new home. A modest two-story with white trim, tucked neatly into a suburban enclave that looked like it had been plucked from the cover of a real estate brochure. The air smelled of barbecue, kids laughed in the distance, the sidewalks were pristine. I stretched after the long drive, glancing over at Sarah, wife. Her sheriff's badge clipped casually to her belt, her shoulders squared with that steady confidence that had carried her through years of service. "Ready to start this new chapter?" I asked. Her smile was warm, reassuring. Absolutely, fresh start, friendly neighbors, a community that looks out for each other. For a moment, I let myself believe her words, that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of peace. We carried boxes until our arms ached, until the sun painted long golden stripes across manicured lawns. Then, a voice cut through the evening like a knife. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I turned. A woman in her mid-50s marched up our driveway with the posture of someone who never bent. Platinum blonde hair, styled with ruthless precision, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. "I'm Karen," she announced, brisk and businesslike, "head of our homeowners association." Her eyes lingered just for a second on Sarah's badge. Something flickered across her face, an unease she quickly smothered beneath a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A sheriff," she said. "Well, that's reassuring." She handed us a booklet, heavy, packed with rules, restrictions, covenants. The cover gleamed like it was sacred. "See that you do," she added, her voice tightening before spinning on her heel and marching away. Sarah flipped through the book. "Guess we've got some homework." I forced a laugh, though unease tugged at me. The days that followed should have been sweet. Morning jogs on tree-lined streets, evening porch swings, weekends with the smell of grilled burgers floating on the breeze. But beneath that charm, something felt off. The kind of quiet that hides behind a smile. Sarah was the first to notice. "Did you know we need approval for any exterior change? Even shutters?" she asked one night, raising an eyebrow. I chuckled. "Guess that means no neon pink." She smirked. "Or parking overnight without a permit." I sighed. "Seems a bit much." And yet every few days, Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, smiling that smile that always felt just a little too tight. "A trash can left out too long. Your grass a fraction of an inch too tall." Always polite, always watching. Always reminding us who held the reins. One afternoon, I was planting flowers when she appeared again. "Lovely," she said. Then flatly, "Did you check page 42? Approved plant species only. We wouldn't want non-natives disrupting our aesthetic." I forced a smile, dirt under my fingernails. "I'll check that." But deep down I knew. This wasn't about flowers. It was about control. That night Sarah's jaw clenched as she looked out our window. Karen lingered just beyond the hedge, pretending to walk by. "She's waiting for us to slip up," Sarah whispered, "and the way she watches me, it's unsettling." I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We'll get through it together." But the truth was, I felt it too. The weight of being observed, the quiet tightening of a leash. And I couldn't shake the feeling. That Karen wasn't finished with us. The morning light filtered through blinds as we unpacked the last boxes. Coffee brewing, paint still fresh on the walls. For the first time, the house felt like ours. "Finally," I sighed, sinking onto the couch. Sarah smiled, though her eyes remained sharp. "Feels good, but—" She glanced at the window. "Karen." As if summoned, a shadow passed by the glass, clipboard in hand, watching. Sarah stood abruptly. "That's it." Before I could stop her, she strode outside, badge glinting, authority radiating from her stance. "Good morning, Karen," she said firmly. "Something I can help you with." Karen feigned surprise. "Oh, just routine inspection." Sarah crossed her arms. "We know the rules, we're following them, but your frequent visits feel intrusive." Karen's eyes narrowed. As an officer of the law, I'm sure you understand the importance of rules. Sarah stepped closer. And as an officer of the law, I also understand boundaries. For the first time, Karen faltered. Then with a stiff nod, she turned and left. But her silence wasn't retreat. It was warning. That night, Sarah sat on the porch, her tea cooling in her hands. Think she'll back off? I asked. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. I doubt it. Something tells me this is only the beginning. And she was right. Because what we didn't know then was that this neighborhood wasn't just about lawns and fences. It was about power. And soon that power would come knocking, wearing a badge that wasn't real and a gun aimed at the woman I loved. Everyone in the neighborhood acted like nothing was wrong. Joggers passed by with polite waves, sprinklers hissed in the morning sun, children chased school buses at the corner. But inside our home, the air was tight, thick with the feeling of being watched. Sarah, dressed in her uniform, badge gleaming, joined me at the table. She sipped coffee, her eyes hard. I went through the HOA guidelines again, she said. You're kidding. Nope, there's even a regulation about the color of curtains, only neutral tones. They want everything to look the same. I leaned back, shaking my head. It's like living in a dollhouse, every detail controlled. Before Sarah could answer, a sharp knock rattled the door. We exchanged a glance. And just like that, the peace of the morning shattered. Karen stood there, of course, clipboard tight against her chest. But this time she wasn't alone. Beside her loomed a tall man, broad-shouldered, a heavy stare beneath his cap. A badge, shiny, official-looking, was pinned to his chest. Karen's smile was sugar. Good morning, I hope we're not interrupting. Sarah straightened. Karen, what brings you here? Karen gestured. This is Mr. Daniels, our newly appointed HOA security officer. We're here to address concerns regarding your property. My stomach nodded. Concerns, we've followed the rules. Daniels stepped forward. His voice was low, deliberate. Your grass is half an inch over regulation, and your trash bins out for too long. Sarah's jaw tightened. Half an inch, a few hours, that's what this is about. The rules exist to maintain harmony, Daniels said. His presence filled the doorway. Compliance is non-negotiable. I watched Sarah hold her ground, her shoulders squared, voice steady. We'll trim the lawn, we'll move the bins, but this level of scrutiny feels excessive. Karen's smile thinned, her eyes sharp. We apply rules uniformly, exceptions lead to chaos. For a moment, the air grew heavy. Then Sarah exhaled, controlled. Fine, we'll comply. Karen's lips curved upward, though her eyes stayed cold. Wonderful, thank you for your cooperation. They turned to leave, but Daniels lingered, gaze locked on Sarah. As a sheriff, I'm sure you know the importance of upholding regulations, he said. Sarah didn't flinch. And as a sheriff, I also know the difference between law and intimidation. The silence stretched. Finally, Daniels nodded once and followed Karen down the driveway. The door shut, Sarah's breath released in a slow stream. This is getting out of hand. I nodded, my pulse was still racing. They're watching everything. Her eyes hardened, voice firm. Then it's time we start watching back. That night the neighborhood gathered in the community center. The usual sleepy HOA meeting wasn't sleepy anymore. The room buzzed with unease, chairs packed with restless neighbors. Karen stood front and center, clipboard in hand like a gavel. Daniels loomed behind her, arms crossed, his shadow stretching across the crowd. Her voice rang out. Thank you all for coming. Tonight we'll address concerns about adherence to standards. A voice cut her off. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who'd lived there for decades, stood up, her face flushed with frustration. I've followed the rules for 20 years, and yet this month alone I've been cited 3 times for a flower pot slightly out of place, for a wind chime too loud. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile didn't falter. Mrs. Thompson, consistency is what keeps our community beautiful. But Sarah rose slowly from her seat, her badge catching the overhead light. With all due respect, Karen, she said, voice firm but measured, this doesn't feel like consistency. It feels like harassment, Residents don't feel safe in their own homes. The room hushed, every eye turned. Karen's expression sharpened. Are you accusing the HOA of overstepping its authority? Sarah didn't blink. I'm saying people feel intimidated, and intimidation destroys community. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and thunderous. The rules apply to everyone, no exceptions. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Rules must be fair, they must serve people, not control them. The silence that followed was electric. Finally, Mr. Alvarez, a retired teacher, rose. His voice cracked but carried weight. Maybe it's time we revisit how these rules are enforced. Time we have an open dialogue instead of threats. The murmurs swelled. Agreement rippled through the room. Karen's jaw tightened. She snapped her clipboard shut. Duly noted, she said curtly. We'll take these concerns under advisement. But as the meeting adjourned, neighbors didn't leave quietly. They huddled together in tight knots, voices raised, anger uncontained. The air in the room had shifted. The mask was slipping. That night, Sarah and I walked home in silence. The weight of it all pressed heavy on us both. The facade of this perfect neighborhood was cracking. And once it cracked, there was no putting it back together. The stars were sharp in the sky as Sarah finally spoke. Think tonight changes anything? I hesitated, maybe not. She shook her head, her eyes dark with certainty. No, this was just the calm before the storm. And deep down, I knew she was right. Because power never gives itself up quietly. And Karen wasn't about to let her empire crumble, not without a fight. The night was still, too still. Sarah and I sat in the living room, the hum of the TV barely filling the silence. The memory of that HOA meeting still lingered, sharp and raw. The neighbors had spoken, the tension had broken through the surface, but something darker was brewing underneath. Then, a knock. Sharp, hard, too late in the evening to be casual. Sarah's eyes met mine, a silent exchange. She rose slowly, her uniform shirt still neatly pressed, her badge catching the glow of the lamp. When she opened the door, the porch light spilled across two familiar faces. Karen, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. And Daniels, towering broad, his holstered weapon gleaming under the yellow light. Sarah's voice was calm but firm. It's late, what do you want? Karen's tone was clipped, rehearsed. We've received reports of ongoing violations at your property, specifically, unauthorized modifications to your backyard fence. I stepped forward, frowning. We haven't touched our fence since we moved in. Daniels shifted his weight, one hand resting deliberately close to his hip. We need to inspect the premises, he said. His voice wasn't a request, it was an order. Sarah's jaw tightened. She took a deliberate step forward, placing herself between me and them. Unless you have a warrant or documented authority, you're not stepping foot onto our property. Karen flushed, anger bubbling under her mask of control. As members of this community, it's your duty to comply. Sarah's voice cut through her words like a blade. And as a sheriff, I know the limits of your authority. You have none here. The air crackled. The standoff was no longer about fences or trash cans. It was about control, about power. Daniel's eyes locked on Sarah's. His fingers twitched near his weapon. And in one terrible moment, he drew it. The metallic click of the slide echoed like thunder in the night. Time stopped. The barrel of his gun leveled at Sarah's chest. Step aside, ma'am, he growled. My heart slammed against my ribs. Do I jump in front of her? Do I scream, distract, fight? Fear roared in my veins, paralyzing me. But Sarah, she didn't move. Her hands rose slowly to shoulder height, palms open. Her voice steady, calm, commanding. Daniels, you're making a grave mistake. Karen gasped, her mask of confidence shattering. Put the gun down, she hissed, her voice cracking. What are you doing? But Daniel's hands trembled. He wasn't backing down. The night air hung heavy with the threat of a single trigger pull. Then Sarah took a step forward. I'm Sarah Mitchell, County Sheriff. Her words rang out like a gavel, sharp and final. You're threatening a law enforcement officer on her own property. Lower your weapon, now. The weight of her words landed like a blow. Daniel's eyes widened. The bravado drained from his face, his hand shook. In the distance, faint at first, then swelling, a wail of sirens split the night. Karen's face drained of color. "No, no, no," she whispered, as flashing red and blue lights rounded the corner. Daniels faltered, his arm wavered. Finally, with a shaky breath, he lowered the gun. Within seconds, patrol cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. In a blur of commands and movements, they disarmed him, slammed him against the hood of a cruiser, and cuffed him. Karen stood frozen on our porch, clipboard hanging uselessly at her side, her mouth open but no words coming. Sarah lowered her hands at last, the adrenaline finally breaking through in a long exhale. One officer approached her, eyes wide with concern. "Sheriff, are you all right?" Sarah nodded, her voice steady though her breath shook. "I'm fine, thanks to you." The flashing lights painted the night in red and blue, neighbors spilling out from their homes, whispering, pointing, their perfect suburban facade shattered in an instant. Daniels was shoved into the back of a patrol car, his head bowed, the gun bagged as evidence. And Karen was no longer the unshakable queen of the HOA. She was pale, diminished, exposed. I slipped my hand into Sarah's, gripping tight. Because in that moment, with sirens screaming and neighbors murmuring, the truth stood clear. The HOA wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about corruption, intimidation, lies. And now it was war. The neighborhood woke up in shock. By sunrise, whispers spread faster than the morning paper. The so-called HOA security officer had pulled a gun on the sheriff in her own yard. And before the night was over, he'd been dragged away in cuffs. For years, Karen had ruled this neighborhood like a queen. Her clipboard was law, her rules unquestioned. But after that night, she wasn't feared, she was pitied. Neighbors who once smiled politely at her now crossed the street. Sarah sat at our kitchen table, the steam from her coffee rising untouched. The lines around her eyes looked deeper, carved by the weight of the night before. "We can't keep this quiet," she said flatly. "The community deserves to know who Daniels really is." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. They'll believe Karen before they believe us. She's been here for years. She has control. Sarah's eyes hardened. Then we don't just tell them, we show them. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The community center, usually half empty, was packed wall to wall. Neighbors whispered, anxious, angry, waiting for answers. Karen sat at the front, her posture stiff, her smile brittle. Beside her, an empty chair stood where Daniel should have been. His absence loomed larger than his presence ever had. Sarah stood slowly. Her voice carried through the room, calm, steady, undeniable. "Thank you for gathering on such short notice. Last night, there was an incident at my home involving Karen and Mr. Daniels." The whispers rose immediately. Sarah lifted a hand, silencing them. "Daniels drew a firearm on me on my property. He was arrested on the spot." Gasps rippled across the room, eyes widened, hands shot up to cover mouths. Sarah didn't flinch, and upon investigation it was revealed that Daniels was not licensed. He is not a security officer. He is, in fact, a convicted fraudster posing under false credentials. The room erupted. Neighbors turned to one another, voices tumbling over each other in disbelief. Karen shot to her feet, her face blotched red. "This is ridiculous. Daniels was vetted and approved by the board." Sarah's gaze locked on hers. "Were you aware of his criminal history, Karen? Were you aware he was impersonating an officer?" Karen faltered, her mouth opened, closed, no words came. From the back, a man's voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Alvarez, the retired teacher. If the HOA can't even vet its own enforcers, how can we trust it with anything?" Another voice rose. "How much authority have you given people like Daniels? Who else have you let slip through?" The tide shifted. The room no longer looked at Sarah with suspicion. Their eyes turned toward Karen, sharp, demanding, unrelenting. Sarah's voice carried above them all. "This isn't about weeds or lawns or fences. This is about trust. Authority must be transparent. It must serve people, not control them. It's time we reconsider who's leading this community." Karen's shoulders sagged. The room no longer belonged to her. Mr. Alvarez stood, voice firm. I propose a vote, a new board, new leadership, and this time done in the open." The room thundered with agreement. Chairs scraped. Neighbors clapped, some for the first time since they'd lived here. Karen's eyes darted, searching desperately for support. But all she found were crossed arms, furrowed brows, and the betrayal of those she thought she owned. The meeting ended not with order, but with revolution. On the walk home, Sarah squeezed my hand. Her eyes were tired but alight with determination. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. And she was right. Because exposing Daniels wasn't the end of Karen's empire. It was only the first crack in the dam. And once a dam breaks, the flood is unstoppable. The night after the meeting, the air in our house felt heavier than ever. Neighbors might have turned against Karen, but she wasn't gone. Not yet. People like her didn't surrender power, they clung to it, even as it slipped through their fingers. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, papers scattered like a storm. Her face was lit only by the cold blue glow of the screen. "I've been digging into Daniel's past," she said quietly, her eyes sharp with focus. "He's not just a fraud, he's a career conman, fake IDs, scams, impersonations, and Karen brought him here." I leaned against the counter, my stomach twisting. Maybe she didn't know. Sarah's hands froze over the keyboard. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to mine. She knew. I didn't have to ask how. I saw it in her eyes, the kind of certainty only a sheriff carried when the pieces clicked together. She spun the laptop toward me. Numbers filled the screen, spreadsheets, bank records, HOA expenditures. "I cross-checked the HOA's financials," she explained. "Money earmarked for repairs, community events, landscaping, it never got spent." My throat went dry. Where did it go? Sarah pointed to the screen. "Private accounts, linked to Daniels and Karen." The truth landed like a punch. It wasn't about grass height or trash bins or fences. Those rules were distractions. The real game was money. For days, Sarah and I dug. Every night after work, after patrol, after pretending everything was normal, we pulled at threads, and every thread unraveled another scheme. Inflated invoices, faked contractor bills, phantom maintenance projects. The HOA wasn't just a homeowners group anymore. It was a cash machine, and Karen had been siphoning from it for years. But evidence wasn't enough, not in a place like this. Karen had built walls, stories, excuses. We needed more than documents. We needed witnesses. That's when the knock came. I opened the door to find Mr. Alvarez standing there, his eyes sharp, his expression set with quiet resolve. "I've heard whispers," he said softly, "about what you're digging into about Karen." I stepped aside and he entered, closing the door behind him. "She's been running this community unchecked for too long," he continued. "I've seen the way she punishes people, the fines, the intimidation, but this money, that's the kind of rot you can't hide forever. I want to help." Relief washed through me, not because we needed allies, but because it meant the community was starting to see what we saw. We spread the evidence across the table. Alvarez studied the papers, nodding slowly. "It's all here, enough to sink her, but you need to be careful. People like Karen don't go down quietly." Sarah's jaw set. "We'll be careful, but we're not stopping." From that night on, it wasn't just us. Alvarez joined us in piecing together the puzzle, adding history, context, details we never knew, old disputes, strange expenses, patterns of manipulation that stretched back years. The web grew bigger and uglier. But Karen wasn't blind. She felt the tide turning. We noticed her car lingering longer at the end of our street. Daniels might have been in jail, but she was still out there, watching, calculating, waiting. And the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. One evening, as Sarah sifted through yet another stack of statements, she looked up, her eyes fierce. "This isn't just about the HOA anymore. This is embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, it's criminal." I swallowed hard. "So, what do we do?" Her answer was simple. "We gather enough evidence to hand it to law enforcement, and we show the community everything. No shadows, no secrets." The decision was made. Over the next week, our dining table became a war room. Binders, laptops, folders, pages highlighted in red marked with Sarah's steady hand. Each late night blurred into the next. The more we uncovered, the angrier we became. Not just for us, but for every neighbor fined unfairly. For every dollar stolen from a playground that was never built, for every family made to feel powerless in their own home. The house buzzed with quiet determination. Even exhaustion couldn't break it. Until one night, the knock came again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze, my chest tightening. Sarah met my eyes, then stood, hand resting on her badge. When I opened the door, Karen's figure loomed on the porch, her smile brittle, her eyes hard. "I know what you're doing," she hissed, her voice low enough only we could hear. "You think you're clever, but you're stirring up things you don't understand." Sarah didn't flinch. "I understand plenty, enough to know you've been lying to this community for years." Karen's jaw clenched. "Careful, Sheriff, this neighborhood has rules, break them, and rules have consequences." Her words dripped like poison. Then she turned and walked away into the night. I closed the door, my heart pounding, but Sarah only stood taller, her expression resolute. "She's scared," Sarah whispered. "That means we're close." She was right. And the closer we got, the more dangerous it would become. Because Karen had already shown what she was capable of. And if she was desperate enough to put a gun in Daniel's hand, what would she do when she realized her empire was crumbling for good? Word spread like wildfire. An emergency meeting was announced, one that would either tear our community apart or save it. That night, the community center buzzed like a hive. Neighbors filled every chair, every corner, whispering in anxious tones. They weren't just curious anymore. They were hungry for answers. Sarah stood at the front, Alvarez at her side. Behind her, a projector lit up the wall. On it, numbers, invoices, receipts, evidence we had spent weeks uncovering. Karen sat among the crowd this time, not at the front. Her clipboard was gone, her smile forced, her posture brittle. Sarah's voice rang out, steady and sharp. "Thank you for coming. Tonight, I'll be presenting evidence of serious misconduct within our HOA leadership." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. She clicked to the first slide. A ledger appeared with highlighted transactions. "These funds," Sarah explained, "were allocated for playground renovations last summer, but instead of going to contractors, they were transferred into private accounts." Gasps, murmurs, neighbors leaned closer. She clicked again, another slide, inflated invoices signed by Daniels. Here, supposed security expenses, but Daniels was not licensed, he was not vetted, he was a fraud with a criminal record. The room erupted in whispers. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her face draining of color. Sarah's voice cut through the noise. "This isn't about tall grass or trash bins. This is about fraud, about betrayal, and it involves the very people who claim to protect this neighborhood." Karen shot to her feet, her voice trembling but loud. "This is a witch hunt. Lies, distortions, she's twisting everything to make me look guilty." But Sarah didn't flinch, she clicked again. Bank statements filled the screen, transfers between HOA accounts and Daniel's personal ones, and Karen. "The documents speak for themselves," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried like thunder. "This isn't just negligence, these are criminal offenses." The murmurs turned to anger. "How could you do this to us?" someone shouted. "We trusted you," another cried. Karen's mask shattered. She sputtered, searching for words. I didn't know. Daniels handled the finances." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Years of fear and frustration boiled over in the room. Then from the side, a voice commanded silence. "Enough." All heads turned. Officer Martinez, respected, steady, stepped forward. He carried a folder under his arm, his uniform lending gravity to every step. He opened the folder, pulling out official documents. After reviewing the evidence, Sarah Mitchell and her neighbors gathered, and corroborating it with our own investigation, the police department has sufficient grounds to pursue charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The room froze, then gasps rippled again, followed by stunned silence. Karen's knees buckled and she dropped back into her chair. The authority she once wielded with a clipboard was gone. She was no longer the enforcer, she was the accused. Sarah stepped forward, her voice softer now. "We've all lived under fear, under intimidation. But community isn't built on fear. It's built on trust, respect, and transparency. Tonight, we start reclaiming that." The room swelled with murmurs of agreement, some voices rising in applause. People stood, clapping, their faces shining with relief and anger all at once. Karen buried her face in her hands. She had lost the room. She had lost her kingdom. Mr. Alvarez rose, his voice carrying through the clamor. I propose we hold an immediate vote to dissolve the current board and form a new one, with safeguards, accountability, and full transparency. The crowd roared with approval. Karen stumbled to her feet, her voice shrill with desperation. You can't do this. I built this neighborhood. You'll regret this. But her words fell flat. No one listened anymore. The meeting ended not with order, but with revolution. Neighbors left the community center that night not as strangers bound by HOA rules, but as allies bound by shared betrayal and shared resolve. Sarah and I walked home in silence, her hand clasped in mine. For the first time, I felt something shift, hope. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't gone, not yet. And people like her didn't fade quietly. They fought tooth and nail, even when the fight was lost. The storm wasn't finished, but the tide had turned. The courtroom buzzed like a hive ready to split. Neighbors filled the gallery, faces etched with betrayal, anger, and something else too, hope. They weren't just here to watch a trial, they were here to see an ending. Karen sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, hair pulled back too tightly. The clipboard she once wielded like a sword was gone. In its place, shackles of fear she could no longer disguise. At the witness stand, Sarah adjusted the microphone, the sheriff's badge on her chest gleaming under the courtroom lights. She wasn't just my wife in that moment. She was the voice of an entire community. The district attorney paced slowly, his voice calm, deliberate. Sheriff Mitchell, can you describe your interactions with the defendant in her role as HOA president? Sarah's voice was clear, steady. She enforced rules with excessive scrutiny, fines for minor infractions, repeated intimidation, and when residents raised concerns, she dismissed them or doubled down. The DA nodded, and Mr. Daniels, the man she introduced as HOA security. Sarah's gaze flicked briefly to Karen, then back to the jury. Upon investigation, Daniels was found to be a fraud with a criminal history. He had no legitimate credentials, and yet Karen gave him authority. He pulled a firearm on me in my own yard. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The DA lifted a document from the evidence table. Exhibit A bank statements, transfers from HOA accounts into those controlled by Daniels and the defendant. The jury leaned forward. The paper trail glowed under the fluorescent lights like chains dragging Karen down. Did you uncover these discrepancies yourself? The DA asked. Yes, Sarah replied. Along with concerned residents, we analyzed the HOA's financials. The pattern was consistent, deliberate, and incriminating. The DA stepped back. No further questions. The defense attorney rose, buttoning his jacket with a sharp snap. His tone was oily, confident. Sheriff Mitchell, could these discrepancies not simply be accounting errors, honest mistakes? HOA books are complicated. Sarah didn't blink. The amounts were too large, the patterns too regular. This wasn't error, it was intent. The defense attorney shifted, his confidence faltering under her gaze. He sat. The judge's gavel rapped once. Proceed. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Mrs. Thompson, voice trembling but fierce, describing the petty fines that made her feel like a criminal in her own home. Mr. Alvarez, steady as stone, explaining how Karen's silenced dissent, buried questions, and twisted rules for power. Each testimony stacked another brick on the wall, closing in around Karen. When the prosecution rested, the gallery buzzed with a strange mix of grief and relief. The judge cleared his throat. Given the evidence presented, this case will proceed to full trial. Karen sagged in her chair, her eyes darting to the gallery. But no one met her gaze, not anymore. Days later, the trial began. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Karen sat rigid, her hands clasped together, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. The charges were read aloud. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Each word landed like a hammer. Sarah testified again, steady as ever. The DA wove the evidence into a story so clear, even the defense's objections fell hollow. The community watched as Karen's empire, The empire built on fear and deception crumbled brick by brick. Finally, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The courtroom was thick with silence. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering prayers, clenching fists, waiting for the words that would decide it all. Hours later, the jury filed back in. The foreperson stood, paper in hand, voice steady. In the case of the state versus Karen Thompson. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. The words echoed like thunder. The gallery erupted, gasps, cries, some even clapping before the judge's gavel restored order. Karen's face went pale, her lips trembling. The queen of the HOA sat dethroned, broken, her kingdom of intimidation reduced to dust. The judge's voice was firm. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Neighbors stood as one, their faces alight with something they hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Sarah turned toward me, her eyes shining with exhaustion, pride, and relief all at once. "We did it," she whispered. But even then, as Karen was led away in cuffs, I couldn't help but wonder. Did we truly finish it? Or was this only the end of one battle, while the real work, rebuilding trust, was still waiting outside those courthouse doors? The trial was over. Karen, once untouchable with her clipboard and saccharine smile, was led away in handcuffs. The queen of rules and fines had fallen, not with dignity but with disgrace. But the end of her reign wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something harder, something quieter. Rebuilding. The neighborhood stood at a crossroads. The corruption exposed had left scars. Trust had been shattered, neighbors divided. Some carried guilt for staying silent. Others carried anger for being targeted. All of them carried weariness. At our kitchen table, Sarah looked over fresh papers, not evidence this time, but proposals, plans, ideas. Her eyes were tired, but there was a fire in them still. "We can't just tear something down," she said softly. "We have to build something better in its place." So we did. An interim committee was formed, made up of residents, people who wanted fairness, not power. Sarah and I helped draft safeguards. Alvarez volunteered to chair the finance subcommittee. Mrs. Thompson, voice shaky but strong, offered to oversee community events. For the first time, the HOA wasn't about control. It was about connection. The first meeting in the community center felt different. No tension. No clipboard waiting to strike. Instead, voices rose with ideas, concerns, hope. One man raised his hand. "Transparency. How do we know this won't happen again?" Sarah nodded. "Regular audits, open records, and every resident will have access to the books. No more decisions behind closed doors." Mrs. Chen, who had lived there the longest, spoke up, her voice heavy with emotion. "It's not just the money. This whole ordeal divided us. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. We need more than policies. We need healing." Sarah leaned forward. "You're right. So let's rebuild our community, not just our board, potlucks, beautification projects, support groups. We remind each other that this neighborhood is more than fences and rules, it's people." A teenager in the back, Jake, whose family had nearly moved because of Karen's harassment, lifted his voice. "And safeguards, term limits. We can't let power get concentrated again." Applause broke out. Agreement rippled through the room. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspicion. It was determination. Step by step, the neighborhood began to heal. Weekends saw neighbors painting playground equipment together. Families organized barbecues on front lawns. Children planted flowers in the community garden, laughing as dirt smeared their cheeks. The shadows that had hung over our streets slowly lifted. One evening, as Sarah and I walked hand in hand, the scent of fresh paint and blooming flowers filled the air. We passed the newly renovated park, where children played long past sunset. Laughter echoed where tension once lingered. Mr. Alvarez raised a glass at a small gathering. His voice cracked but carried far. "To resilience, to unity, and to the promise of a brighter tomorrow, may we always remember the strength we find in each other." Glasses clinked, applause followed. For once, Karen's name wasn't spoken, not out of fear, but because it no longer mattered. As the stars came out overhead, Sarah leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant only for me. We turned the page on a dark chapter, but the story of this community, it's still being written. I squeezed her hand, my chest heavy with pride. She wasn't just my wife or my sheriff. She was the reason our neighborhood had a second chance. And I realized something. Strength isn't always loud. It isn't always in the gun drawn or the gavel struck. Sometimes it's in quiet resolve, in neighbors standing side by side, in the courage to tell the truth when silence is easier. That night, watching our neighbors laugh under the glow of street lamps, I understood the lesson this fight had carved into us. Power can corrupt, fear can divide, but dignity, courage, and truth, they always outlast the ones who abuse control. We hadn't just saved our home. We saved each other. And that was the real victory. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.